The Pilgrimage of the Heart podcast is brought to you by pyo.yoga, an online studio for all your yoga needs, including videos in Spanish and Russian. This podcast is also brought to you by Pilgrimage of the Heart Yoga, located in San Diego and serving over 1,000 yogis a week.
Welcome to Pilgrimage of the Heart interviews. Join us as we explore fascinating people and ideas in the world of yoga. Welcome, everybody. This is Sujantra McKeever with Pilgrimage Yoga Online for our podcast series. Today, our guest is Leslie Kamanoff. He is a yoga educator inspired by the tradition of TKV Desikachar. He is an internationally recognized yoga and anatomy teacher who also does a lot of work with the breath. He has over 37 years experience and leads anatomy and yoga methodology workshops around the world and for leading yoga associations. Leslie's book, Yoga Anatomy, which was co-authored with Amy Matthews, is one of the seminal writings of yoga that's used in education these days and has sold over 500,000 copies. Leslie is the founder of the Breathing Project, a nonprofit educational corporation dedicated to the teaching of individualized, breath-centered yoga practice and education. His courses are also available online, which gives access to the worldwide audience at yogaanatomy.net. Welcome to the program, Leslie.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
And to start at the beginning, what first brought you to the practice of yoga?
Actually, it was my dad. He was going through, I guess you can call it a midlife crisis back in the 70s, and started doing a lot of things, which included yoga. And he actually is the one that invited me to my first ever yoga class, which was in New York City. The year would have been 1978, and it would have been at the Shivananda Yoga Center on West 24th Street. So that's where I took my first ever yoga class.
And how old were you then?
I was 20.
Wow. And you have you have really focused in on anatomy and breath work. And I'm wondering what brought you or what inspired you to focus in on that element of yoga?
It was mostly curiosity at first. I'm what you call a self-learner. I guess the fancy term is autodidact. I never did well in structured learning environments, so I sort of barely got out of high school and didn't really pursue college education. I was living on my own from a pretty early age and just pursuing things that interested me. And once I connected with yoga, that really sort of took over. And I did my teacher's training with Shivananda in 1979 and started teaching pretty much right away. And I became very curious about all the differences I was seeing in the students in front of me and their bodies and their capabilities, why certain things were easy for some people and harder for others, and why certain people had an easy time with some poses and a difficult time with others. And so that led me naturally to trying to understand the anatomy a little bit better. Pretty much everything I learned was very practically oriented, very much on the job, working with people in yoga classes and eventually working in fields like sports and dance medicine and physical rehabilitation and athletic training and things like that. So it was very much just following my curiosity.
And in terms of teachers, you mentioned your inspiration coming from the tradition of TKV Desikachar, and I'm wondering did you know him personally, or you studied through his writings?
Yes, I did become his student. I met him first in 1988, so I'd already been doing yoga for about 10 years at that point. And I was drawn to this idea that it was all in the breath, that there was this breath-centered way of looking at the practice. Because I had on my own, prior to meeting him, been experimenting quite a bit with my own ideas of how to coordinate certain breathing patterns with certain movements. And when I met Desikachar, he literally turned that whole thing upside down and kind of triggered a breathing crisis of my own initially, where I had to sort my own body out and my own breathing. And then I became, even after that, even extra curious about what had happened anatomically in this sort of change that I experienced in the way I was breathing in my practice and moving my body. So I formally approached him to be his student after that, and he accepted. And for a while, I was everywhere where he was that I was able to get to, because he was still traveling around the world and teaching at that point, both in the States and in Europe. And I did spend some time in India with him, although certainly not as much time as some of his more senior students, like people like Gary Krapsel and some of the European students and other folks like that.
And I noticed that one of your organizations is called the Breathing Project, so that stems from this this focus on breath and breath being the essence of the practice for you?
Yes. When I started the studio, well, actually, it was a nonprofit before it was a physical studio. The idea was to communicate this idea that it was an ongoing investigation, not a finished product. So the word project seemed to make sense. And to call it the Breathing Project was really to just to let people know that there was a place where this idea of putting the breath at the center of this inquiry about yoga and movement was really the main focus. And the other practical consideration at the time was, when we started the studio back in 2003, there was no space in New York City where people who were interested in this teaching tradition of Krishnamacharya and Desikachar could come and teach in any way that they pleased. There were a bunch of teachers who were connected with the tradition who were teaching at various places around town, but there was always someone else's agenda or someone else's system or someone else's class structure that they were obliged to stick to. So there was no place where they were free to come and experiment and teach as they wished. And so it became a real hotbed of that kind of investigation right from the beginning.
And what's the website for our listeners who might be in the New York area to explore
breathingproject.org. And right now, as of the summer of 2016, we have exactly 1 year of programming left because we're closing the studio next August. So we're letting everyone know that this is their last chance to get involved in the programming that we have there.
Wow, and is it just a shift for you, or is it a rent? I mean, is it business?
Well, it's not like, well, you could say that partly it's because of what it's like to pay Manhattan rents on a monthly basis,
right,
but that's really only
that's a lot.
part of the picture. It really is about Amy Matthews and myself wanting to see what's next for us in terms of where we teach and how we teach and what we're going to be doing for the next phase of our lives. And we put in a good 13 years to the studio when it'll all be said and done. And that's a good chunk of our adult professional teaching lives. And we really felt like it was time to bring this particular phase to a close and do it consciously and as elegantly as we could and see what's next.
And in terms of sharing your teachings, you have a website with online courses available. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. This is something we started about 5 or 6 years ago, and it really took off. It was one of the earliest fully online, full courses that got put out there. And it really is a recorded version of the year-long trainings that I do in New York City at the Breathing Project. And Amy has her own courses up as well at the same location, the yogaanatomy.net. She's actually, what she does, she calls embodied anatomy or embodied asana. And it was really to give people access to these teachings who don't live in New York. And, it would often happen that I would be traveling around, whether it's in the States or internationally. People would get very excited about the sort of things they were learning. They wanted more. And then, before the online courses, their only option is really to move to New York for a year and take the courses, which is really not financially or practically feasible for most people. So it's a way of letting people all over the world have access to the teachings. And we've had a tremendous response. So far, we're in over 40 countries around the world with well over 2,000 students enrolled. So it's been really quite wonderful to see the response out there.
Congratulations. That's really sharing yoga with a lot of people that wouldn't otherwise have access to it.
Yes, thank you. And the other thing we learned is that for many people, it's actually a more optimal experience to learn online than to be in person. And that sounds funny to say, but, and of course, nothing can replace personal contact. And yet, when you're taking a course online and watching this all unfold, in a browser on your computer, there's a pause button. You can stop. You can stop me from talking, which you can't really do when I'm in person. You can rewind. You can go to the bathroom and come back to it without missing anything. You can read the transcript, and you can also interact by asking questions and getting responses and things like that. So we do make it as interactive as possible, but there's a lot. It's more of a multimodal approach than just sitting in a room listening to someone talk. So that's been interesting to learn how many different ways people interact with the material.
And so you've been in the realm of yoga for 37 years. What does your own daily personal practice look like these days after all these years?
My daily personal practice is mostly about moving my body around in space as I do my work and as I breathe in such a way that I don't need to do a lot of asana to correct the tension that I build up in my daily movements. And the way I would explain it is that when I was younger, I did an awful lot of asana practice and pranayama and all that when I was living at the ashrams and running centers for the Shivananda organization. And I had time for that, and now with, more of a job and a family and all those responsibilities, there really isn't the time to do that lengthy kind of daily practice. And what I've had to do is take the lessons I learned on the mat into the way I hold my body when I'm working on a client on the table, or when I'm in front of a room, sitting or standing or moving and teaching or demonstrating. And so either I don't do a lot of practice at all, or I'm doing a whole lot of it all the time. You can look at it both ways. And of course, if I feel something building up in my body that needs addressing, I do throw my mat down and do what I need to do just to maintain myself. But the way I think about it is that if I can stay functional enough to live my life and occasionally play some basketball or ride my horse or demonstrate in front of a room full of other yoga teachers without making a complete ass of myself, I'm pretty satisfied. I don't miss all that much some of the more advanced poses that I used to be able to do when I was younger, because frankly, if I tried to get back to them now, I'd probably end up hurting myself.
Now, let's imagine that some of our listeners out there are brand new to yoga. How would you explain to them the importance of breath in terms of the yoga practice? Because everyone sees the asanas, but what would you tell someone about breath and the importance of it?
Well, you can think of asana as the postural work of asanas is how you stabilize your body in space, and breath would be more about how you mobilize the space in your body. And when you put it that way, you see that they're just different sides of the same coin, because the same muscles that you're using, that you're learning how to use more efficiently, more effectively to do the postural work of the yoga asanas are the same muscles that have to coordinate in order for you to breathe effectively while you're doing all of that. On a deeper level, what the focus on breathing also teaches us is the relationship between that which we can control and that which we cannot control, because breathing is both. Okay, it's both voluntary and autonomic. And the way that relates to postural practice is quite frankly, not every asana is for every person. Not every person's body can do every pose. And so, you're not really in control of certain of those things. You're not in control of some of the genetic inheritance that you've gotten in terms of your body proportions or the arrangement of your connective tissue or how your joints behave. And so this inquiry is very important in order to keep yourself safe in asana practice. You need to know what not to try to change, because it's not changeable. Whereas learning what is changeable and what you can improve is where you need to focus your efforts. And breathing tends to teach us those lessons, because a big portion of our breathing is certainly not under our conscious voluntary control. And so when we put the breath at the center of the practice, it really does teach us those lessons.
That's a great explanation. So you teach, in terms of your breath work, it's not traditional pranayama. You've developed some techniques of your own?
Some of it is. There's a real value in learning a technique, whether it's a traditional pranayama technique or one of the other ones that I've kind of made up along the way. But as long as it's a technique, that means that there's a correct way of doing it. And the value in that, I find, is that when you teach someone a technique, basically you're teaching them a new way of breathing. And the value in that is that when you're trying to learn a new way to breathe, what you have to do is unlearn your old way of breathing. And that, to me, is where all the benefits come from. So the value in a technique, whether it's a traditional one or a non-traditional one, is that there's a right and a wrong way to do it. And when you learn to do it right, what you're discovering in your system is all the stuff that gets in the way. Dealing with the stuff that gets in the way is really what the work is. It's the same with asana. I'm always telling people that yoga isn't about doing poses. It's about undoing what's in the way of the poses. And it's the same thing with breathing. The confusion comes in sometimes when this idea that there's a correct way to do techniques leads to this false idea that there's a right way to breathe all the time, which is not true. Because the reason we learn techniques is to free up our system so that our breath can be free to respond to whatever is needed in the moment. But there's no one pattern or technique that will suffice for everything we need to do with our body and breath. So there's a correct way to do techniques, but there's not a right way to be breathing all the time. And that's an important perspective that I like to share with people.
And in your online courses, do you offer, is it all intertwined, the learning of the yoga anatomy and the breathing, or are there unique courses that just focus in on the breathing?
Actually, there's two main courses that I teach. One is called Principles and the other is Practices. Principles is more about the anatomical information, which I do teach in an experiential way. It's not all just information. Practices is more about practicing. It's more about me teaching practice with some of the information there as a support. So one format is lecture demo, and that's Principles, and the other is more practice with explanation, and that's Practices. But the breath is always there, whether we're talking explicitly about the breathing mechanism or about the spine or about how the limbs function, because that's sort of what ties it all together, at least for me, from my perspective. And certainly that's something that my teacher, Jessica Char, was quite focused on as well.
Yeah, I'm just flipping through your book, which I've read quite a bit of, and it's such a great book. I just so much recommend the Yoga Anatomy to everyone out there to deepen your, especially for teachers, to deepen your ability to teach, and for everyone actually to deepen their own practice.
Yeah, it's funny, I run into people who aren't yoga teachers who have the book, and the way that a lot of people use it is they say, I used your book to look up where it was that I was hurting. I wanted to know the name of that muscle or that bone or that attachment or whatever where I had pain. And it's kind of interesting when you hear people using the book in ways that you frankly never envisioned. So there's a lot of different ways to interact with the material. But the front matter, just the written chapters as opposed to the analysis section where we go through each pose, is really to me the heart of the discussion, because that's where we go into some of the fundamental concepts.
And in our yoga, we have two yoga studios out here in San Diego, and we have the yoga teacher training. And in the Yoga Alliance certification, it's less than, I think people receive less than, I think it's 10 hours of yoga anatomy.
It's 20 hours. It's 20 hours at the 200 level, which is odd, because I was one of the people that actually helped, compose those standards way back when. And right. I remember very distinctly fighting for 25 hours, and I don't know who or when it was responsible for reducing it from 25 to 20, but I believe the current standard is 20 hours of anatomy. And actually, now that I think of it, there is another online course that Amy and I both put together, which is called Fundamentals, which is used by 200-hour teacher training programs to provide that 20 hours of anatomy. And we even found a way to build contact hours into the online way of learning anatomy. And more and more studios are adopting Fundamentals for the anatomy component of their teacher training program. So that's really nice to see.
Yeah, and I think that your materials are a great way for teachers to keep learning, because you can only learn so much in 20 hours, and in the whole world of anatomy, there's so much more to learn.
Oh, sure. And to be honest, the Fundamentals program has way more than 20 hours of material in it, but it certainly covers the minimum standard of 20 for the 200-hour training.
And in your own journey, is there a certain place, that a certain teaching or lineage, or is it to Desikachar that you go for the quote-unquote spiritual side of yoga to get your inspiration and motivation and vision for things?
Breath is spirit, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, the word respiration comes from the same root as our word for spirit. And I don't think you have to look too much further than the body and the way it breathes and the way it operates at the most fundamental level to find some very, very, very deep spiritual connection to our existence. And this is completely distinct from any kind of Vedic source teachings you might go to get the so-called spiritual side of yoga. There's a deep intersection, of course, between the truths of the body and of life and the ancient teachings. And in fact, the more ancient you go with the teachings, the more elemental they become and the more directly connected to our life processes. But Desikachar and his father, Krishnamacharya, of course, the teachings there were very deeply rooted in the ancient traditions, particularly in the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali. But that's a very, very integral part of what was communicated to us by Desikachar. This is a spiritual teaching. The asana is the most obvious, most popular part of it, but that's just one facet of this beautiful gem, which is the totality of the teachings of yoga.
And having been practicing since the 70s and seen all the changes in technology and the growth of yoga, where do you see or hope that the interest in yoga in our world today, what do you see it growing into, or what do you see happening with it?
It grows in dimensions and directions that, frankly, I would never have even begun to imagine back when this was not called an industry or even a job, for that matter. It was a hobby because no one was really making a living doing it. So I frankly, can't imagine where it can possibly go from here, except to continue what it's been doing, which is to grow and expand and diversify, and to look into new delivery systems like online, and who knows what we'll be able to do with virtual reality, in a few years. So there's all of that, and I just hope it stays as free as it's been. One of the main battles that I've been involved in for the last several decades is to keep yoga as free from interference and regulation as we can, which is why I've been far less critical of the Yoga Alliance recently than I had been from when it started, because the Alliance actually has taken a stand against regulation, as they're doing very effective work at keeping teacher training programs free from vocational training licensure and all of that. So I'm a very strong advocate for the free market, for people's freedom to innovate, which means to create fantastic products, but it also means the freedom to create, kind of silly things.
Right.
But even the silly things, like, I don't know, rage yoga or broga or beer yoga or yoga booty ballet or whatever you want to call it, you naturally have a reaction to hearing the latest permutation, like, oh, really? Honestly? But I've learned to ask myself this question when I have that reaction, because if yoga is about anything, it's about questioning your reactivity to things, right? So I ask myself this question, is this latest silly thing that I'm judging to be dumb, is it a potential pathway for some people to eventually go deeper into what I consider to be the heart of the teachings? And the answer really is always yes, regardless of how silly the manifestation of this, product is. And so, I say bring it all on. The cream will rise to the top, the crap will sink to the bottom, and that's just the nature of the free market. I just think it should be kept as free as possible so that can happen.
Yeah, that's how I like to think of a yoga, as there's so many entry points into it, and then people go as deep as they're inspired or able to.
Yeah, and it's not just yoga. Some people get their lives turned around by doing a step aerobics class or kettlebell training or whatever. You never know what's going to wake somebody up to their own body, to their own breath, to their own inner existence. It's not the exclusive proprietary property of yoga to be doing that for people. There's so many pathways into a deeper experience of yourself that I wouldn't limit it to just what yoga is up to in the world.
Well, I think that's the kind of attitude our world needs, for yoga to just keep spreading and growing.
I think so, and that's the one I've come to believe in and to stand for. So just as I said, let's keep it free and keep it innovating and see where it goes, and the quality will always find an audience, as will everything else,
Well, Leslie, it's been great talking to you. A lot of great wisdom, and can you go over once more where people should go to find out about you online? Can you give us those,
sure.
those addresses once again?
My personal website, which we haven't mentioned, is yogaanatomy.org, O-R-G, and that's Yoga Anatomy, both words fully spelled but connected.
Okay.
So there's two A's in the middle of it. And then there's yogaanatomy.net, which are the online courses. And as I've already mentioned, there's also breathingproject.org, which the studio at least will be around for another year. So
and is that Breathing Project or The Breathing Project?
No, there's no the in it. It's just breathingproject.org.
Breathingproject.org.
Thanks for clarifying that.
And then, are you on the world of Instagram or Twitter?
Oh yeah, sure. Well, my Twitter
you don't want to forget those.
Kamanoff. Yeah, it's just my initial L Kamanoff. That's my Twitter handle, and it's the same on Instagram. And I've got a Facebook presence. I'm pretty hard fitness online, so there's a lot of different pathways into it. Although my Instagram feed is really nothing more than different shots of me eating and drinking in different exotic places. So you won't find me doing fancy asanas.
Right.
It's mainly a travel log and a food blog, basically. So that's my Instagram feed.
Anam Brahma, food is God.
Yeah, right. Well, there you go. It all starts with food.
Yeah. Well, great, Leslie. We really appreciate you taking time to share your wisdom and inspiration with us. And again, really encouraging all our listeners out there to get the Yoga Anatomy book and to explore all that Leslie has created in the online world. So I want to thank you again, Mr. Kamanoff, for joining us. And thank you.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for taking an interest.
Thanks for joining us. This has been a production of Pilgrimage of the Heart Yoga. Join us at our studios here in San Diego or visit us online at pyo.yoga. Namaste.